You're here, listening, in the dark, I guess. I'm not sure if I should tell you these stories, but since you're already here, tell me, where are you right now? And what time is it there? Leave it in the comments. I hope you're not alone, because, after this, you might wish you were. They had once said that Clara had no voice. She did. It had simply been kept locked behind her teeth, coiled like something ancient, waiting, not sleeping. What had not been said had often echoed far louder than anything that could have been shouted. Her presence had gone mostly unnoticed by those who passed her in narrow hallways and cafeteria lines. Pale, thin, her face framed by a tangle of black curls that hadn't seen a comb in months. Her eyes often fixed on things no one else could see. Books had become her shelter. Not cheerful ones, not hopeful ones. Her hands had carried Lovecraft and Bronte like relics. Notebooks filled with sketches of twisted forests and weathered teeth. The macabre had made sense to her in ways the living never had. Breath after the fire, grief had not made a sound. No wailing, no shouting, only smoke-stained dreams and long frozen nights. Her parents had died together, choked by flames that had climbed the staircase faster than help could reach. Clara had watched from the lawn barefoot and wordless as their world had burned into ash. Break afterward, she had been sent to live with her uncle, a man of strict kindness and daily rituals. His son Theo had taken her in like a sibling lost in the fog, but kindness could not shield her from the school's quiet brutality. They had whispered when she walked by, laughed when she didn't speak, mocked her silence, her books, her clothes, and Eli, the loudest of them all, had made her life a performance for others. His laughter had followed her like a shadow. She had said nothing, but she had listened. Long break. It had happened on a Saturday. Cold wind, yellow leaves clinging to branches, the sky a dull slate. Her uncle had needed new shoes. He had brought Clara to the edge of town, where broken shops clung to each other like old bones. In the back of a thrift store, beneath cracked ceiling tiles and flickering lights, it had been found, hanging alone, unlabeled, unreasonably vivid. A red hoodie with a wolf's head sewn into the hood. The ears had been pointed. The eyes, amber glass, seemed to shimmer in the dimness. The mouth had curved into a subtle snarl, threaded with silver, too lifelike, too detailed, too real, and it had fit her perfectly. Breath, no permission had been asked. It had simply been pulled on, her fingers sinking into the sleeves like they had always belonged there. Her uncle had hesitated, but said nothing. At home, Theo had watched from the stairs, his mouth parting with something between admiration and concern. The air around Clara had changed. Something beneath her skin had begun to shift. She had stared into the mirror that night. The hoodie's shadow had covered half her face, and for the first time in months, she had smiled. By Monday morning, the hoodie had become her second skin. Its fabric had clung to her like breathless air, warm and grounding. It hadn't been washed. It hadn't needed to be. No one had dared to touch it. Clara had walked the school corridors like a crimson shadow. The wolf's ears had twitched slightly with every step, though they hadn't moved. Her eyes had stayed lowered, yet nothing had gone unseen. And when people had spoken near her, they had lowered their voices without knowing why. Breath in the classroom, her chair had creaked differently, colder, older, as though the weight it now held had changed. Mr. Lang, her history teacher, had called on her, perhaps out of habit, and as her gaze had lifted slowly from her desk, his sentence had faltered mid-air. He had blinked, tried to recover, but the room had already grown quieter. No answer had been given. None had been needed. Clara had returned to her notes, and her pencil had moved with the grace of a knife carving a warning. Break outside. Leaves had fallen too slowly. The wind had bent around her like it recognized her scent. Even the birds had silenced their calls when she passed beneath the trees. Those who had once whispered had started glancing behind them when alone. Shadows had stretched farther than they should. The forest near the school had begun to feel aware. It had always been there, bordering the track field and the fence, but now it had begun to draw attention, not by noise, but by invitation. Paths had seemed to shift subtly, twigs had snapped where no feet had stepped, and somewhere deep within, breathing had been heard. Not animal, not human, something in between. Long break Eli had stayed loud. Mockery had been his armor, sharpened by his audience. And that afternoon it had been Clara's turn again. She had passed him by the lockers, the hoodie zipped to her neck, her steps deliberate, her expression blank, and he had laughed, louder than necessary, the sound bouncing too sharply against the walls. But when Clara had turned her head just enough, when her gaze had found his for the briefest moment, he had gone silent, only for a second, but something in his throat had hitched, like a growl had caught there instead of laughter. He had shoved past her, more force than needed, more fear than he would admit, and from the shadows of the hallway Clara had watched him go, not with malice, with patience, breath. That evening a storm had begun to gather, not overhead, but in the trees. Leaves had turned upward, animals had hidden early, and Eli's friends had decided to cut through the forest trail behind the houses. A shortcut, a dare. He had gone alone, bravado painted on his smirk. The hoodie had not been seen, but something red had passed between the trees. The wind had sharpened, the path had narrowed, and somewhere deeper in the sounds had changed. Laughter had turned to stillness. Stillness had turned to snapping, then silence. By morning the police had been called. Eli had not returned home. Only his phone had been found, face down, still recording. The audio had captured footsteps, laughter, a pause, and something that growled without lungs, something that spoke without words. The screen had glitched into static. The timestamp had frozen at 12:47 a.m. The forest had remained closed, but the wind had whispered. Clara had arrived at school with damp hair and scratched knuckles. The hoodie had looked darker than usual, almost black along the sleeves. The wolf's glass eyes had glinted like fresh dew. She had sat in silence, as always, but no one had dared look too long. By the third disappearance, silence had become policy. No assemblies, no announcements, only a subtle tension that gripped the air like frost, invisible, but inescapable. The teachers had stopped asking questions. The students had stopped speaking her name, but everyone had watched her. Clara had arrived each morning in her red hood. Her steps had echoed louder than expected. Her eyes, when they met another's, had left a kind of mark. Not physical, not visible, just an impression, like a paw print left in wet earth. Breath whispers had returned softer now. She wasn't there before. I saw her in the trees. I dreamed about her last night. Theo had tried to talk to her once. His concern had grown too heavy, but her door had remained closed. The air behind it had smelled like pine, and the soft rot of damp fur. One night he had stood outside her room, his hand hovering near the doorknob. From inside the sound of low breathing had reached him. Too steady, too deep, not Clara's. He hadn't tried again. The town had changed. Animals had vanished. Streetlights had begun to flicker after dusk. Wooden fences had appeared to warp inward. The woods had crept closer. Branches once far from houses had begun to touch rooftops. Windows had shown more than reflections, and always somewhere that hoodie had been seen. Red in the fog, red at the corner of a road, red walking into shadow, and behind it always a shape too tall, too twisted. One that didn't quite follow her but didn't quite leave her either. Long break Ashley had been the last one to mock her. The final insult hadn't been clever. It had been tired, automatic, a reflex. Clara had passed her in the library, a book clutched to her chest, dust falling from the pages with each step. Ashley had sneered, half-hearted, a pale imitation of past cruelty. But Clara had paused. Her head had tilted, not in confusion, not in pain, in amusement. Ashley had not seen it, only felt it, like something had curled around her ribs and tightened just once. She had left the building immediately, never returned. Her house had stood dark for 2 nights. On the third, lights had flared. Police had come. Something had been found in the backyard. An impression in the soil. 4 deep claw marks. A trail of red cloth. But no Ashley. Breath at school, Clara had read silently. Her book had rested on the desk. Though her eyes had remained fixed forward, the pages had turned themselves. Theo had passed her in the hall. Later that day, his mouth had opened, then closed. He had seen something watching from under the hood, not her eyes, something older, hungrier. And yet, behind the thing wearing red, he had seen Clara, still inside, still small, still silent, watching it all happen. Break that night. Thunder had rolled in too early. The air had smelled of copper and moss. The clouds had held their breath. Clara had stood beneath the trees behind the school, her head tilted back, her hands loose at her sides. The red hood had rippled in the wind, and behind her, gathered in the dark, the others, those who had once been loners, misfits, quiet mouths and hollow stares, now drawn together, now standing in a circle, eyes wide, feet bare, hearts thudding in time with something they couldn't name. Clara had raised one hand. The trees had bowed. The wind had laughed. It had begun with shadows. Not long ones, not flickering, but dense, fixed, felt before they had been seen. They had pooled beneath lockers, curled under desks, waited in doorways. By morning, 3 more students had vanished. No struggle, no sign, only teeth marks on a metal locker, claw-shaped gouges in tile, and in one case, a trail of deep red threads leading out through a smashed basement window. Breath. The school had remained open, silent, but open. A performance of normalcy played to empty seats. Teachers had shown up, taken roll, taught to blank spaces. Clara had been present every day, always in red, always quiet, but by now she hadn't been seen walking. She had simply appeared, at her desk, at her locker, on the roof, in the woods, always at the edge of sight. And when eyes had tried to find her clearly, they had failed. The mind had simply slipped. Names had begun to fray, dates blurred, time had started folding. Break one afternoon, Theo had climbed the attic to find Clara's childhood boxes. Instead, he had found fur, scraps of gray and black, bristled, matted. The air had smelled of wet soil. In the corner, a drawing, charcoal on old paper, had shown a girl with a wolf's skull for a face, surrounded by trees made of open mouths, and beneath the image, a line had been written in looping script. The forest keeps its promises. He had descended the stairs slowly, his hand never leaving the rail. That night, his dreams had turned to bark, and the moon had looked like a maw. Long break. The town had stopped asking questions. People had moved away, windows boarded, streetlights left unrepaired. Still, the red had returned each week, sometimes in the trees, sometimes at the river. Once, standing outside the bakery at dawn, the glass eyes of the hood had watched everything. No longer just a cover, now a mask with purpose, and under it, Clara had not remained. Not fully. The thing wearing her had learned to walk like a girl, to sit like a student, to blink like something still pretending to be human. But in the quiet, when wind passed through closed windows and whispers came from the sink drain, it had been felt. The difference. Breath. Years passed. Children told stories. Of the girl who'd walked silently in red. Of the forest that moved closer if stared at too long. Of claw prints found near schoolyards after a full moon. Some claimed to have seen her. Others denied she ever existed. The school eventually closed, its walls swallowed by vines, its gym overtaken by moss, but the hoodie remained, hanging from a broken branch on the tree line, unfaded, unworn, waiting, break. And when storms rolled in from the east, and thunder rattled the roots of the town, some claimed to hear something in the wind, not a howl but a laugh, sharp, joyful, hungry, as if the forest still remembered the girl it had once promised strength to, and the wolf that had come to collect. And it never would. The final transmission had never been sent. The aircraft, registered as Astrojet 713, had been prepared for a routine flight. Origin, Kinara International. Destination, Yeonju Capital Airport. 12 crew members had boarded. 229 passengers had settled into their seats. It had been a quiet evening, the kind reserved for calm skies and quiet instruments. All checks had passed. All systems had responded. The aircraft had lifted from the tarmac at 017 local time. Ascension had occurred without fault. Velocity had increased smoothly. Lights along the aisle had flickered into place. One by one, like memories awakening, First Officer Reyes Calderon had completed his routine. The captain, Marin Listera, had remained silent longer than usual. A calm man, precise, not prone to distraction or delay. Shortly after crossing the Kilo 1 beacon, the captain had offered rest. A suggestion had been made to stretch, hydrate, breathe. The door had opened with a soft hiss. Reyes had stepped into the forward galley. A warm drink had been offered by one of the attendants. The click of plastic cups, the distant hum of passengers sleeping, or whispering, or thinking of home. Then the door had closed. Breath. Reyes had returned minutes later. His hand had reached for the keypad. The access code had been entered. Denied. Entered again. Denied. A pause. Then a knock. No answer. Break. A third attempt. The emergency override used. Denied. A breath had been held. Then a fourth knock. Louder, followed by silence. A glance behind him had revealed the look of confusion in the attendant's eyes. Another keycard had been fetched. Another attempt had been made. Still, the door had remained sealed. Still, the cockpit had remained silent. Then the shift had been felt. Not a jolt, not turbulence, but a smooth, deliberate turn. One imperceptible at first, but obvious in time. A deviation from the expected line. Reyes had turned toward the central display near the crew jump seat. The flight path projection had flickered, then vanished. An unease had risen. Still, the cockpit had not answered. Still, the captain had not spoken. Long break passengers had stirred. Lights above the seats had blinked. A child had begun to cry. The scent of coffee had gone cold in the air. Reyes had tried to reach the captain through the internal phone. No tone. No reply. The comms panel had been dead. Transponder. Dark. ACARS offline. Altitude descending. Purposefully. Quietly. Like a ship slipping beneath the surface without a ripple. Breath. A message had been drafted. On a secured device. A report that would never be sent. Not through airwaves. Not through satellite. Typed with hands that trembled against reinforced steel. Outlined in panic. Framed by duty. And behind it all the growing certainty that something had been taken from them. Not just control, but time. The descent had continued. Not a dive. Not a drop, but a slow, steady slope into darkness. Outside the windows, the stars had begun to vanish. Not from cloud cover, not from altitude, but as if swallowed. The ocean beneath had stretched endlessly, no longer marked by light or land, just the curve of the earth and the breathless abyss below. Inside, murmurs had risen, a language born of fear and confusion. Soft voices had asked questions. Reyes had tried to answer them. but his voice had cracked. He had told the crew to move calmly, to check belts, to remain visible. The chief attendant, Delia Knox, had made rounds with practiced grace, but her eyes had not left the cockpit door. She had known something was wrong. She had not needed words, breath. Passengers had begun to notice the silence. No announcements, no course updates, no captain. Screens had gone dark. Only a static flight graphic had remained, frozen mid-arc. Then the lights had dimmed again. Not from turbulence, not from power failure, but from intention. One by one, cabin lights had faded into twilight. An artificial dusk imposed over tired eyes and beating hearts. Break. Some had begun to pray. Others had gripped armrests, or hands, or memories. A man had pressed his forehead to the seat in front of him. A child had clung to a toy that no longer comforted. And still, no voice from the cockpit. Reyes had remained by the door. His fists had grown raw from pounding. He had spoken through gritted teeth. He had begged. He had commanded. No answer. The aircraft had banked again. Left, southwest, toward nowhere, toward silence. Long break. He had run the numbers in his head. Fuel, distance, altitude. It had not made sense. There had been no system warning, no onboard fault, no hijacking alert, only absence. The aircraft had become a shell, a body without a voice, a machine driven by silence. And still, the descent, breath, far below the ocean had waited, black and depthless, not cruel but indifferent. Reyes had pressed his ear to the door. Still, no sound, not footsteps, not breath, not static, only the hum of systems obeying a pilot who would not speak. And somewhere in that hum, a new sound had emerged, soft, Reyesing, a low, continuous vibration beneath the floor, like something massive exhaling. Break. He had tried the backup comms, the beacon system, the emergency code. No trace had been acknowledged. No signal had escaped the hull. They had been taken out of view, out of range, out of context. And in the aisle behind him, a voice had asked if they were going to die. He had answered, "Not if I can stop it." But the words had tasted like ash. The aircraft had stopped descending, but it had not leveled. Instead, it had begun to drift. Altitude had remained steady, speed unchanged, direction uncertain. There had been no GPS confirmation, no ground radar contact, only the instruments inside now prone to flicker. Inside the cabin, the pressure had not dropped, yet breathing had become difficult, not from altitude, but from something unseen. Breath. Oxygen masks had not deployed. No alarms had been triggered. No emergency lights had flashed. And yet, every passenger had begun to hold their breath, one by one, without prompting, without warning, as if instructed by something low and unspoken. Reyes had returned to the cabin. His eyes had scanned the faces. Some had been asleep. Others had been praying. Some had simply stared ahead, unmoving. In the back, a child had stood in the aisle, her hands limp at her sides, her gaze fixed on the emergency exit door. When called, she had not answered, only blinked once, and returned to her seat without turning her head. Break. Delia Knox had reported whispers, passengers speaking in their sleep, or while awake, but never aloud. Their mouths had not moved, but still, whispers had filled the air, foreign, ancient, wrong, like echoes from the deep hull of a ship, long swallowed by the sea. She had recorded them. When played back, only static had been heard, except for one interval, 9 seconds long, where the voice of a man, not on the manifest, had said, "He let it in." Then silence again. Long break. Reyes had returned to the cockpit door. He had leaned against it, closed his eyes, and this time he had felt it. Not the captain, not movement, but presence. Something beyond the metal, behind the instruments. Not watching, but waiting. There had been no attempt to redirect, no response to calls, Only the hum of compliance, the autopilot untouched. Breath, a soft sound had echoed near the floor. Not machinery, not wiring, a drip. Reyes had crouched. The light from the emergency floor panel had glowed dull blue, and beneath the cockpit door, a thin line of liquid had emerged. Not oil, not fuel, water, dark, cold, brackish, as if the ocean had seeped into the aircraft from within. Brake, at the rear of the plane, passengers had begun to collapse into a kind of waking sleep. Eyes open, limbs limp, breath shallow. The child from earlier had been heard humming, a song with no melody, no rhythm, just sound that matched the low hum vibrating in the walls. Delia had crossed herself, and then whispered that something had moved in the galley when no one had been there, that her reflection had smiled before she had, that the cabin had become inverted, that they were not flying anymore, they were being flown. The aircraft had ceased to exist on all known maps, not from signal loss, not from damage, but as if erased. The air traffic networks had no trace. The weather satellites had registered no mass. Flight 713 had vanished from airspace, yet still it moved. Instruments on board had continued to glow, but their numbers no longer corresponded to the sky. Altitude readouts had pulsed, location indicators had looped, and the compass had begun to spin. Breath Reyes had reached his limit. His fists had pounded once more. The skin on his knuckles had torn. His voice had cracked with desperation. No longer words, just sound. Behind the door, the cockpit had remained dark, and then the hum had stopped. For one long second, silence had ruled, and in that silence, a sound had come. Not a groan, not a scream, but a gasp, a single, breathless inhalation, like something woken. Break in the cabin. Every light had gone out. The windows had turned black, not with night, but with void. Passengers had sat motionless, not unconscious, but empty. Reyes had turned to Delia, only to find her face wet with tears, her lips forming a prayer that had no God left to hear it. From the center of the aisle, the girl had stood again. This time, her eyes had been wrong. Too wide, too bright, too deep. She had pointed toward the front of the plane, and the walls had creaked, not from pressure, but as if something inside them had shifted, something trying to stretch. Long break, the cockpit door had opened on its own. Reyes had stepped forward. The corridor, cold and hollow. The seat had been empty. The controls had moved on their own. Lights blinking, without command. Dials turning, without input. And at the center screen, a reflection, not his. Something taller, distorted, smiling where no mouth had been. Behind him, a low whisper had begun to rise. It had spoken in loops, a phrase over and over, indecipherable, yet familiar. And beneath his feet, the floor had begun to soften, as if becoming wet, as if the ocean below had met the aircraft from within. Breath, the final log on Reyes' device, had ended with one unfinished line. We are beneath the waves, but we have not crashed. The plane had not descended. The plane had not landed. The plane had simply slipped into water, into sky, into silence. Break to this day, Astrojet 713 had never been recovered. No wreckage, no black box, no signal, but sometimes, on stormy nights above the southern corridors, distorted radar pings had been received. Always the same altitude, always the same coordinates, and always followed by static, except once, where a tower reported hearing a voice, faint, exhausted. The words had cracked through the static, like a final breath. Tell them, I tried.